On today's episode, we talk to the creator of bert, the arcade game, Warren Davis. Welcome to the Nostalgia Test Podcast, the show where two longtime friends put their mainstream pop culture past to the ultimate test, the Nostalgia Test.
Woo! Dan, what's going on?
Manny, how are you?
I gotta jump in right here.
Just jump right in.
I'm excited. This is gonna be a different episode for this season. I had to. You take up all the announcements. You got the drops. You got the intro to the podcast. So I have to sometimes jump in. Plus, I gotta insert my New Yorkness where we just interrupt everybody anyway.
Okay.
But you're in LA. You got soft, bro. You got soft.
That's called happiness. That's called happiness, Manny.
Anyways, so excited about today's episode. It's going to be a little bit different.
Absolutely.
You know, on the Nostalgia Test podcast, this is not really a test. We're not doing a test. This is going to be like the orange years.
I'm so ready to sit and learn and talk about something that as a kid, Manny, you went to arcades as a kid, right?
Yeah, Nathan's was right. Well, there was one at the Long Beach boardwalk. Was very popular. The ones, obviously, arcades at the mall. And then Nathan's was huge.
Yeah.
And I just remember everything that when I think about arcade, I think about the coin, that little belt thing that they had back before coin machines were a thing. You used to have to go to somebody and get change. And they had that quarter belt thing, the change belt attached to them. The guy counted change so quickly. I can't do math like that. And I just remember that metal belt with arcades. So and I actually was also, when I was in film school, there was a guy that was dating my cousin at the time. He was also a filmmaker and he was really into arcades. He even came up with a movie called Arcadians, where it was just about kids who were really into arcades. Wow. The competitions, one of his friends was he had the high score on one of the arcade games.
Wow.
In Centipede or something like that.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it was crazy. So, I remember arcades. I thought arcades were such a good time. And then I guess Nintendo comes in or Atari, I guess, and then kind of ruins that whole aspect.
But I think, and I loved arcades too. I remember going to arcades when I was a kid. I remember playing all sorts of arcade games. I think one of the things too was cool when I was living in Queens, they had the Museum of the Moving Image and they had a whole arcade retrospective on one of the top floors, and they had really old arcade games that you could play, and also games and you could see the history of the arcade game and it moving towards what we have now. And then I spent a lot of time at Grasshopper Comics playing Magic the Gathering and playing that Marvel fighting arcade game. Hours just standing in front of that, getting my ass kicked over and over again. But I think that's the cool thing about arcades. The good arcade game forces you to continue to put quarters right in that machine, and you just want to keep putting quarters in it. But all that being said, we are really excited, as everyone, you all could tell in the audience, about our guest today. We have a really great guest, who arcade game developer, and also someone who's in the Arcade Hall of Fame, right? I guess Warren Davis. Warren, thank you so much for being here.
Well, hello there. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, when we first met and we were talking about this, I was like, oh, I cannot wait to have Warren on the podcast because I have so many things to talk about, but also this is a good moment for us to kind of learn about these things that we see as kids and kind of take for granted that they exist, and kind of they're just there, and seeing someone on the other side who've created these amazing machines for, and games for us to kind of spend our time in our childhood going to them and playing. But I would love, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just hop right in.
Sure. Well, I got into the arcade industry in 1982. January of 1982, I started at Gottlieb Amusement Games. It was Gottlieb, of course, one of the great pinball manufacturers from the early 20th century, along with, Williams, Bally, Stern, Midway. There were tons of them in the early part of the 20th century. But then in the latter half of the 20th century, video games came out in 1970s, and coin-op especially, particularly. And most of the pinball manufacturers got into it. So that's kind of where I entered the picture. I wasn't there at the very beginning. I was still in college in the early 70s, but actually I was in high school in the very early 70s. But well, I graduated. I had a degree in a master's degree in electrical engineering, and the idea of making video games was a dream job. So I was thrilled to have that opportunity. Although there's a little bit more to it. I don't want to bore you with a million details, but feel free to ask any questions about stuff. But yeah, so I came in 1982. Q*bert was my first game. Didn't really know much. I worked as a supplemental programmer on another game, and learned the ropes of the hardware. And then, they were like, all right, make a game. So that turned out to be Q*bert. So that was very fortunate for me. And, but my career went on in the arcade industry for almost 15 years, 13 or 14 years. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and I worked in the home game industry for years. I worked for ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, for a couple of years. I was a Disney Imagineer for 4 months.
That's still awesome. I got obsessed with, I got to jump in right here, because there's a Imagineer series now on Disney Plus.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And I was like, oh my God, I want to be an Imagineer. That job just looks so cool. Basically you get paid to imagine anything, and they're like, all right, let's figure out how to do it. Yeah. It's so cool. I was floored watching the series, and I was just in awe. Yeah. Now let me ask you. So were you a programmer, a computer programmer?
Yep.
So and did you know you wanted to be making games, or you could have gone into I don't know, being a programmer for satellite tracking systems or something like that, right?
Yeah. I'd say, here's the thing. So from my very earliest age, I always knew I wanted to entertain people, whatever that meant. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't particularly want to be an actor. I didn't particularly want to be a singer or a musician. I just knew I liked entertaining people. And when I was in high school, the two career choices I wanted to follow going into college were either filmmaking or computers. And of course, my guidance counselor, my parents, they all steered me to computers. That seemed more like a real job than filmmaking. But I didn't mind. That was fine with me. So I studied computer engineering. I studied a program that was sort of like hardware and software. So it wasn't just programming, but also computer design and circuitry and things like that. And it wasn't until later that I really sort of drifted more towards the software end of things. But I think that was a wise choice on my part. I really do like software and software design. Anyway, but the idea of making a video game, once they were invented and I saw them and I played them, I thought this has got to be the best job for a computer engineer. But I didn't know how to get that job. I had no idea where you go or who you talk to.
Right.
So out of college, I just got a regular old engineering job. I worked for Bell Laboratories. I went to school on the East Coast, upstate New York, RPI. And then I took this job outside of Chicago. So I moved to the Midwest and started this job, which I liked. It wasn't terrible. I enjoyed it. But eventually I became disillusioned at Bell Labs, and I left to study, of all things, improvisation at Second City, which I was introduced to in Chicago when I moved to suburban Illinois, and I would go into Chicago on the weekends. I'd see the Second City shows, and I think, oh, that looks like fun. I think I could do that. So I went to the box office at the Second City Theater. I said, well, where do you go to learn this stuff? How to do this? And they pointed me to what was at that time the only improv school in Chicago. This is 1981.
Yeah.
There was no Second City Training Center.
That's right.
The only place you could go for training, and a place where a lot of very famous people went, is the Players Workshop of Second City, run by Josephine Forsberg. So I studied improv there and started performing. I quit my job at Bell Labs, and I thought, oh, this is going to be my career. But eventually, you need to live and you need to pay your bills. So I had to start looking for a real job, and I took some crazy little jobs along the way. But I would also look at engineering jobs in the paper. And the craziest thing was that right at the end of 1981, I saw an ad in the Sunday Tribune looking for video game programmers. I couldn't believe it. It was Gottlieb. They had an ad in the paper. Wow. So I answered that ad, and I guess the rest you can say is history.
Wow.
That's
first of all.
Go ahead, man. Go.
I went to school for film. So I'm not a filmmaker. I became an electrician, and now I own my own brewery.
Oh, so shameless plugs.
That's LITHOLOGY brewing.com. That's crazy that you were about to make that life decision. And I mean, wow, that's a crazy life trajectory. And then then you like get this job. My thing was like, so did you come up with Qbert, or like you were in a group and like you guys were thinking, let's make this game. Yeah. And let's design this character.
So the evolution of Qbert came from basically management said, make a game, period. That's it.
Wow.
And
I love that.
I was a programmer at Gottlieb at that time. The programmers were the game designers. It was their responsibility to come up with an idea, because basically one person would code the entire game. Wow. But I was very fortunate to be, given an artist to work with named Jeff Lee, extraordinarily talented guy, and he became my collaborator. So, because it was my first game, I wasn't egotistical enough to think, oh, I know exactly how to make a video game. Just the opposite. I was like, I don't have any idea. So, I was just sort of punting, and Qbert itself started just as a programming exercise. I wasn't trying to make a game. I was just trying to learn a couple of concepts. For example, randomness, the balls bouncing down the pyramid of cubes, they come down randomly. Yeah. It was just me trying to figure out a way to implement a random number generator, and gravity, because in the little project I'd worked on before Qbert, there was no gravity. Things fell at a constant rate. So I was like, I kind of want to see how I can mimic real world physics just a little bit better. And that's, and so I had this idea for the balls bouncing, and the pyramid came from looking at some art. Jeff had created this, this cube illusion, but he created it to fill the screen for another programmer. And that programmer was just using it as a backdrop. He was just using it for art. It wasn't functional. But when I looked at it, I thought, if you carve that into a pyramid, every time a ball bounces, it has one of two ways to go, right? That's binary. And programmers love binary choices. And so if you took a binary bit, right, a bit for every row of this pyramid, you could fit an entire path for a ball in a byte, which is 8 bits. So all you need is a random number generator to generate random bytes, and boom, I have random paths for these balls falling down. And then I was programming physics to make the balls bounce. And that's all. I thought, okay, that'd be cool to do that, just so I could teach myself how to program this stuff. Once I had a pyramid and balls bouncing down it, well, people at the office would look at it and go, wow, that's really cool. What is it? What are you going to do with it? And I'd be like, well, I don't know. But the next obvious thing would be to put a player character and have some player jumping around. And again, that's where Jeff Lee came in. I asked him, I said, do you have any characters you've kind of drawn up just with no particular game attached to them? And he was like, yeah. And he put a bunch of characters on the screen. Oh, wow. And I was like, I like that one, the big one with the big long nose, And of course, Jeff had designed him that way, the idea that he would shoot out of his nose. But that was too complicated for me. I just needed a guy jumping around the pyramid. But Jeff was very gracious, and he let me use the guy, and he gave me all the orientations of the guy that I needed, facing up and to the right, up to the left, and all that stuff. And off I was with the next thing I knew, I had a player character jumping around this pyramid. And then it was like, well, what do I do now? What do I do next? And literally the entire game happened that way. I would put something in, look at what I had, and then say, well, what does it need? What should I put in next? And that's literally how the game evolved.
Wow.
Oh, wow. So, oh my God. So you had the character in there, and then you're like, okay, he's now going to go up the pyramid, and like he has to.
Well, Q*bert jumps all over the pyramid, right? I mean, Q*bert can just jump all over the pyramid.
But his goal is to get to the top.
No.
Right? Isn't that? No. What was the goal of Q*bert?
Demonstrated a lack of knowledge of the goal of Q*bert. That's going to be ball.
I played Q*bert maybe one time. I'm going to be honest.
Q*bert changes the color of the pyramid. Like he's trying to change the color of all the little boxes that he jumps on.
Yeah, the top of every, he jumps on a cube, and the top of that cube, the top square, will change color. And by the way, that was another thing I was kind of stuck was I had this player character jumping all over the pyramid, but what's the point of the game? Mm-hmm. And we had a vice president of engineering named Ron Waxman, and he and this other guy who was the VP of business development, Howie Rubin, they literally were the creators of the video game department, and they were our protectors from management, which is a whole nother story I can get into. But Ron would stay late at night, and Ron was the kind of guy who he was very scary. If you didn't know him, you would be scared of him. He was hugely large, round. He just never looked like he smiled. He always looked very gruff. He smoked a cigar, and in reality, he was the sweetest guy. But you would not know that if you didn't know him. So, and at night, sometimes like if you were working late, he'd stay and he'd sit behind you, and you just hear him breathing. You'd be working or whatever, but he'd be behind you, and it was like Darth Vader. This,
oh man.
You just hear him and you smell that cigar smoke. But and one night I was like, had the guys jumping around the pyramid, and Ron goes, "What if the cubes change color when he lands on them?" And I just thought, yeah, that's a good idea.
Wow.
And
that's funny.
Again, it just evolved. If people came up with ideas that I thought were good ideas, I would take them and use them. And if believe me, a lot of people came up with a lot of ideas I did not take. But I was the filter because I had to code everything that went in the game. And if I thought something was out of my scope, or I didn't know how to do it, or was going to make my life too difficult, I just said no.
I know.
So
go
was
ahead,
it still? When did it turn into like, okay, this is no longer a training exercise. This is going to be the game.
Yeah. I think it had gone far enough that I knew that it could become a full game. And I think when Howie Rubin, the VP of business development, when he saw it at some point, he tells this story that's a pretty funny story. I don't know if it's entirely true, but he says like he went away on a business trip to Japan. And he says when he left, there wasn't really much going on. There wasn't much to see. And he came back 2 weeks later, and it was like a completely fully formed game. And that's when he put it on the schedule. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think he's exaggerating a little bit.
Wow. I mean, I love Q*bert, but it's funny because we talked when we first met about how I talked about Q*bert being on Atari, but there's a different translation between the arcade and the home game. And I remember you saying something like, "Oh, well, the arcade game is, better developed and, this and that." And I'm like curious, like, well, what are the differences? Like even in that game, but that you find the differences between arcade development and what we see as like home game development as well.
Well, if you look at the games at the time, 1982, let's say, the Atari 2600 was our home competition. I wouldn't call it competition because even though, our pixel resolution was like 256 by 240 pixels, which is basically, no resolution. I mean, we have phones that are like, 4K. So it's if you think about it, our pixel resolution was very low. But our color resolution was 16 colors, and we could choose out of a palette of about 32,000 colors. So we could pick 16 colors out of 32,000, and that was our color resolution. The Atari was made to display maybe like 4 colors. So that and again, the pixel resolution was even less than the arcade games, and so it was designed to do Pong. So the hardware was a huge limitation. Although I have to say, the programmers who had a program for the Atari 2600 found crazy inventive ways to make it do a lot more than it was literally designed to do. But unfortunately, the Atari 2600 version of Qbert I thought was just terrible, just horrible graphics. And maybe the gameplay was all right, but as I remember, the tops of the cubes that changed color, they were like 2 pixels thick or something. It was ridiculous. But again, they had real severe limitations. Of course, then other systems came out. The ColecoVision, I thought, had a really fantastic port of Qbert because it was capable of displaying better color resolution, better pixel resolution. But the arcades always tried to stay one step ahead of home games. That was sort of, that was our thing. And we did that up until I'd say the 90s. I think it was in the 1990s, the mid 1990s, where the home systems and the graphics cards available started to outperform the arcade machines.
So as far as you're developing this game, I always have a question with arcade games. Like, so you were talking about gameplay. And I'm always like, when I'm thinking like in an arcade game, it's a quarter suck, right? Like your goal is to get, for it to be hard enough that it's challenging, but easy enough that you can feel like accomplished. And then when you die, you're like, wait, I want to put more quarters in because I could get to the end. Yeah. So like, is that in the back of your brain when you're developing a game? Or was it just like, I'm just developing a game?
Let me tell you a little bit about the way the business went, okay? Because I worked for Gottlieb, and Gottlieb was a manufacturer. We manufactured video games. We made our money by selling those video games to distributors, okay? Now, a distributor is a person or is a company that takes those video games and they put them in places like pizza parlors, arcades, bowling alleys, and they take a cut of whatever the game earns, okay? So they don't actually sell these games to arcades. Generally, they put them in and they take a cut.
So they make a VIG,
huh?
They make a VIG. In the construction industry, it's like a VIG. They get, anytime it was being like, if the game earned $800 that weekend, they get a percentage of that.
Yeah. It's a VIG. Yeah. I learned a new term today.
In the construction industry, it's like you. Like, let's say somebody was like, oh, I know a great electrician, call Manny. And if I got called, the contractor would tell me like, hey, the client's going to call you, give him an estimate of $2,000 and put a VIG in there for me. Yeah. Like add $200 because I gave you the recommendations. So you get the VIG.
Contractor secrets.
So anyway, so that's how the business worked. So, now, if a game didn't collect quarters, well, then distributors wouldn't want to buy it from us. So, even though we didn't actually make money based on how many coins the thing took in, it was in our best interest. And I was certainly aware of that. Although when I was making Qbert, I didn't really care about that so much because it was my first game. I was just happy enough to get something done. And once all the elements were in there, and I started to tune it, because that's the next stage. Once you've got all the elements in there, then you have to tune it. And that's where I had to start thinking about that at least a little bit. You don't want to make it too easy. You don't want to make it too hard. Originally, the only feedback I'm getting is from the people in the office who are playing it, right? And they're giving me a lot of feedback about, oh, it's too hard, or you do this and that. And, the joystick shouldn't be at a 45-degree angle. Oh, what? You shouldn't be able to jump off the pyramid and die. It's too hard. Wah, wah, wah. People are always complaining. But
I'm just thinking because that's like a child, like my 5-year-old nephew, like, this is too hard. Like, that's funny that programmers are like, no, they were even upset. That's
well, funny. Listen, I did want it to be challenging, obviously, but I also, I wanted people to have to learn some things,
Yeah.
Anyway, there were a couple of things I stuck to my guns on, and there were some things that I relented, and I made it a little slower and a little easier. But, that tuning process continued after we actually put it out on test in some arcades. and we would watch people play it, and we get some feedback that way. We also had focus groups. So, there were a variety of ways to get feedback. But to answer your original question, I mean, it really was not foremost on my mind when I was developing it, because I was just too green. I was just too new to think about it.
So what was it like to see the game once it was done and constructed, and you could see it like that, like to see it out in the public? I mean, this is such an interesting question to me, because it's like with musicians or filmmakers or things like that, it comes on the radio, it's like this, you see your movie. But when a game developer, and especially someone who makes an arcade, there's a real physical part to it that you can literally go to and see it out in public much more. Like, what was that like to see your game out in public for the first time?
It was crazy. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, seriously, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to behave. I'll tell you this one story. So the game was released, it's starting to filter its way out in the world. And there was a bar in Chicago. This is where I lived in Chicago at the time. There was a bar called the Gaslight Corner, and it was an actor's bar. Because at the time I was, even though making video games was my day job, I was taking acting classes at night. I was taking a 2-year Meisner technique at a place called the Lois Hall Studio, which happened to be literally next door to the Gaslight Corner. And there was a point where the Gaslight Corner got a Qbert. They actually so awesome. Got, the bar where I'm hanging out has my game. And I have to say, back in those days, I kind of kept my acting and my video game making completely separate. Because I really didn't want to be pegged as one thing or the other. And I was, afraid that if people pegged me as a video game guy who I'm just playing around in this acting world, and they wouldn't take me seriously, and kind of vice versa. So I really didn't intertwine those. But I do remember there was one guy who, I don't even know, you may know who this is, you may not, but at the time he was performing on the Second City main stage. His name is Tim Kazurinsky. He's probably best known for being in the Police Academy movies. But a lot of these Second City people would hang out the Gaslight Corner. And I just struck up a conversation with him. And I remember I revealed to him that Qbert was my game, that I made that game. And it was the first time that I had done that. And I don't know, it was just such a weird feeling. First of all, just watching people play and not telling them is a weird feeling, but then telling somebody, that's my game, I made that game, it was so weird. I felt very, I don't know, it was a joyful thing, but it's really funny because then we went and had a conversation, because he's also a writer, and we had this conversation about script writing software for computers, which at that time didn't exist.
No.
And he was like, you should write some kind of script writing software. That would really be helpful. And I thought, yeah, you know what? That would be a great idea. But, I already had a day job, and so I left that to other people. But boy, yeah, could have cornered the market.
It's like, I made Qbert. I mean, you're talking to me about script writing software?
Yeah. But then, of course, many different script writing softwares came along, and eventually Final Draft sort of won out. But
Yeah. Wow. That's really cool. And Qbert has lasted. I mean, I played it and I still remember playing it. And I think it's one of those games that, even though in its simplicity, is still really challenging. I remember playing it again when I was at the Museum of the Moving Image. They had a Qbert, and I was like, man, this game is actually really much harder. And then I remember Manny and I have done episodes on, games from Sega Genesis. And when I go back and play even games from the Sega Genesis, I'm like, these games are way more difficult than I remember. Like, we played Echo the Dolphin, and I couldn't even get past the first 2 seconds of the game. And their games are so complex with their graphics, but I feel like not easier, but I don't know, the challenge of solving a puzzle or solving the board or something like that isn't really in there, where Qbert was had the interactiveness, and also you have to solve this puzzle. Because I remember in Qbert, if you go back, sometimes on some levels it changes the color back. So you're like, oh, now I got to go back and get that one. I got to go back. And it was so interestingly challenging. But when I think of it in its simplicity, it's it was just like a really great game. I'm really, I don't know, I'm blown away by the fact of how it just kind of came to as like an exercise almost. And then here it is kind of like developed into a game.
Well, I think, I have a sensibility that I love puzzles. I'm a puzzle guy. And, there were certain things that I wanted to put in there. Like, again, I wanted to make it challenging, but I also wanted to make it something, you had to kind of think about.
Mm-hmm.
And like when people tell me that they're not very good at Qbert, I try to offer a little bit of advice because the thing about Qbert is there are times where the smart thing is not to move. Like I think a lot of people shoot themselves in the foot because they're always constantly moving.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times where you just want to sit and let something pass you by or scope out what you need to do. And it's those little breathers that I think some people don't take advantage of. And I think that helps you a lot. Some people are very good at. That's the other weird thing. In fact, we got reports within a few weeks of releasing the arcade game, which, by the way, was released in October of 1982. So this year, 2022, is the 40th anniversary of Qbert.
Holy nostalgia.
Wow.
Coming up this October.
Wow.
But we got reports within a few weeks of people playing for hours on a single quarter. Wow. Which freaked me out because it's like, oh no, I did a terrible job of tuning. People are playing it for literally hours at a time. So that prompted me to go back and create not a completely new, but an enhanced version, which I dubbed Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert, which you may not have heard of because it was never officially released.
Really?
But it did.
They didn't want to take it or like they...
Well, I literally, Jeff and I and Dave Thiel, by the way, I need to mention Dave Thiel, who did the sounds for Qbert, and we could talk about his contributions, and we should because they were huge and added a great deal to the game. But he was on to other things. But Jeff and I worked on Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert because it seemed like it was too easy out there, and I was worried about that, and so we came up with this version, but. It went, management tested it, but they put it out on test 3 months after the original Qbert. Qbert was still filtering into arcades. It was still brand new some places in the country. So I think it was just too soon. And my thought was, well, hold on to it for a year and release it in a year. And I still, to this day, I have no idea why they did not do that. It just doesn't make any sense to me, but they didn't.
Yeah, it never got like released. Qbert 2.
Huh?
You could add like a Qbert 2, like
that's
like
what
second one.
If you held on to it, it would have been a Qbert 2. Although I didn't want to call it Qbert 2. It's a little pedestrian. So that's why I called it Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert because people would say, "Well, what's different about it?" And I said, "Well, it's faster, it's harder, and it's more challenging." So
it's that acting.
Yeah, you have to do
lines.
50 cents instead of 25 cents.
No, they wouldn't have gotten away with that.
No,
the 50-cent thing came a little bit later. Yeah. I'd say the 50-cent thing probably came in with maybe the Laserdisc games a year later. Yeah, but they didn't. And so I put it. I ended up getting an engineering cabinet of the original Qbert, and it's called an engineering sample because it's not a production cabinet. It's sort of Frankenstein together, but I put Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert in that cabinet, and that's been in my home forever, ever since 1983 or whenever I got the cabinet.
Wow.
And but in 1997, when I was working for Disney, one of the guys that I worked with knew the guys who did the MAME project. Are you familiar with MAME? MAME stands for Multi-Arcade Machine Emulation. It's software that runs on a PC that emulates arcade hardware. So if you take the ROM images, like, the ROMs or the chips that go into these arcade games that have the program and the artwork, if you just take that data as a file and plug it into this software emulator, the emulator basically emulates the hardware and plays the game.
Oh, wow.
And there were thousands of video arcade games you could play on your PC with the development of this MAME emulator. Anyway, so they had Qbert. They had emulated Qbert. And I told the guy, well, I have these ROMs for this unreleased version. And it's just a ROM swap. It's the exact same hardware. And he was like, well, you want to give me the ROM images and I'll hand them over to the main guys. And that's exactly what I did. And
Wow.
and he handed them over. And now since 1997, faster, harder, more challenging Qbert has been available to play.
Oh, wow.
Man.
That's cool.
It's so weird
Wow.
when we get the inside stories of these worlds because like Manny and I are on the other side of the screen, literally just button smashing. And to think
Yeah.
about like everything that happens on the other end is just like, it's these unbelievable journeys. I mean, you even said like the sounds in Qbert, like, and as well. I mean, if you'd like to talk about that, because I'd love to know about that, because when I think of those older arcades, like the sounds are so interesting, and all like how you get those sounds and choose that sound for these things.
Sure. Well, Gottlieb, again, pinball manufacturer for many years, and pinballs have sounds. And so there was an electronic soundboard that we used on our pinball machines. And it had a variety of things, synthesizer chip and stuff like that. And we were using the same exact soundboard for Qbert. And it turns out that there's a chip on our soundboard called a Votrax. And the purpose of the Votrax is to generate human speech. And it does that by putting together strings of phonemes. Now, if you don't know what a phoneme is, it's just a little piece of sound.
Yeah.
So like if you made the F sound, that's a phoneme. If you make a little vowel sound, those are phonemes. And when you string phonemes together, you get words, right? Well, the sound quality was just awful. I mean, it was like robotic and nasty. And Dave particularly seemed to have trouble on pinball machines trying to get it to say bonus. I guess it didn't sound like bonus. It sounded like bogus. And, he just hated this chip and thought it was terrible. But that's what was available at the time. And he had the brilliant idea for Qbert. What if I just throw random numbers at this chip? And that's how Qbert's speech was created. He's literally just throwing random numbers at this phoneme generator. And so it's putting out random phonemes.
Oh, wow.
And the crazy thing is that people think they hear stuff, curse words and such.
Yeah.
And the reality is they might be. It's by,
Yeah.
some curse words are just two phonemes. If you get those two random phonemes together by chance, you'll hear that word, but it's not programmed to say anything in particular. There's only two pieces of actual speech in the entire game.
Wow.
And that is when you turn the power on, from, the electricity, literally, it says, "Hello, I'm turned on." That's one piece of speech. And the other is after you've entered your initials in the high score table, I believe, he says, "Bye-bye."
That's it.
And other than that, there's literally no actual speech programmed. It's all random.
Is that why the illustration of Qbert, like, it looks like the curse word symbols, like,
Yeah.
when he's speaking?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea was, he gets hit in the head, Yeah. So that was sort of like, it was all just sort of, and then, I think Jeff Lee was the one who had the idea for the cartoon balloon and created it.
Wow.
It was all just, a miracle of the right idea at the right time.
Did you know it was going to be a hit?
No. I mean, how could I? I didn't know anything. I knew that I liked it. I knew that I found it enjoyable. I knew that other people in the company thought it had potential, but I mean, until it went out into an arcade and started to get some coin collections, there was no way that I could possibly guess or imagine that it would be popular. And then when it finally came out and it was popular, I was just stunned at how popular it was. It was the hit of the trade show that it came out in November, let's see, October is when it started rolling off the production line. But I believe in November was a trade show where it was first introduced in the coin op industry. And it was like, the hit of the show, and people were calling it the game of the show, and it got great reviews in the industry trades. And it was. And
Do you remember who you were, I guess, the arch nemesis of that year was? Like, what Qbert was going against?
There were a couple of great games that came out that year. Joust was one of them.
Oh, God.
Which was designed by a friend of mine, John, somebody who he got to know and work with in the aftermath, John Newcomer, and Popeye was also predicted to be a very hot game.
Wow.
Somehow did not withstand the test of time, but in 1982, Popeye was considered one of the hit games.
Oh wow!
I'm wondering if there was a pole position or maybe a pole position too, but yeah, there were a number of games that people were very excited about. But I have to say that was also a time. 1982 was still a time where you could come out with a great game, and you know the arcade industry went through a crash in 1984.
Oh, wow.
So 1982 was still kind of the good years, the golden years.
Wow.
So did the arcade game, you said that it had a crash. Was that because of like home entertainment systems or like computers? Like
no, actually, I don't believe that is true. There were a couple of reasons. One was that the industry had grown so fast. Late 70s, arcades sprang up everywhere. Everybody was opening up arcades, and they needed product. And so in addition to the major players, you had a lot of just sort of like no-name manufacturers jumping up and just putting schlock out. You know, they would just put anything together just to make some money. And they could make money because people needed games to fill their arcades. And then what happened was, I think the players got burned out. The innovation maybe went away, let's say, and there were a lot of knockoffs and repeats of games that had already been out. And I think players got fatigued, and the growth became unsustainable. And basically, the whole industry just imploded, like in 1984. The other part of it was Laserdisc games. That's another big factor, because Pioneer came out with a particular model of Laserdisc player, and a lot of game manufacturers put that in their cabinets, and they came out with Laserdisc games. You may remember Dragon's Lair, Space Ace, Firefox from Atari.
Yeah.
I think it was Atari. And Gottlieb was no different. They came out with Mach 3, which was a huge hit. And then I actually made a game, a Laserdisc game called Us Versus Them. And God, we probably don't have time to get into it, but that's a way more interesting story than Qbert, I think, because it had live action actors. It had scenes with actors interspersed with flying footage and computer generated jet planes and spaceships having dogfights over this flying footage.
Wow.
So it was pretty ahead of its time and unique. But what happened was the Laserdisc players weren't exactly ready for prime time. So people in the arcades realized if you were playing a Laserdisc game, you could play it for 20 minutes and then pound on the side of the cabinet. And the Laserdisc, which is, basically like a record player in a way, it would skip and it would lose sync. And then the game would go like, I don't know what's going on. You get like a blue screen, and then you'd go to the arcade operator and say, hey man, my game just screwed up. I want my money back.
Oh,
and this started to happen.
So it's like the tilt
too much,
Yeah.
And so they were starting to lose money on Laserdisc games. And then there was just like all the distributors were like, that's it. We're not taking any more Laserdisc games. And so the game that I developed, Us Versus Them, came out literally just when this was happening. In fact, we had Gottlieb sued their distributors, their own customers, for reneging on their orders. They had ordered so many Us Versus Thems, and then they basically said, no, we don't want them. We're going back. Wow. And Gottlieb was building these machines, and then they didn't want to take them. And there was a lawsuit. I don't know exactly where it ended up. But anyway, so that also contributed to just a real crash in the arcade industry in 1984.
Wow. I mean, we're going to have you back and talk about Us Versus Them. But like, one of the things that was interesting when we were looking at, you sent us some links, and I was looking at some of the other things you've been connected to, like the T2 game, NBA Jams, right? I think it was, and Mortal Kombat. And actually, Manny, I don't know when you looked at it, if you missed that, you could play as Warren's head is on in NBA Jam.
Holy nostalgia.
So
yeah, so
it's like.
So I was going to ask you. So you were responsible for the arcade game of this, or
no,
the home game?
Yeah, let me be clear about that. So my contribution to Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam was the digitization system that allowed digitized actors to be used in the game.
Wow.
So I developed this this software that used a hardware digitizer and sort of was tuned to make life easy for our game developers so that they could digitize live actors and use them in the games.
Wow.
And so I didn't contribute to the game of Mortal Kombat. That was Ed Boon and John Tobias and a bunch of other people. And I didn't contribute to the game of NBA Jam. It was Mark Turmel and a bunch of other people. But like I said, my contribution was their ability to generate digitized graphics, which is kind of what Midway became known for in the 1990s. That was their, we were heads and shoulders above anything anybody else was doing.
Yeah.
And
I mean, like the ability to do that, to put the faces. I remember that was a big deal. Like to have that head or whatever, like you wanted to, that's what you wanted to get to. So
yeah,
that's great.
So what the NBA Jam team did is they took all the guys that worked at Williams and they digitized our heads so that in the tournament edition, not the original, but NBA Jam tournament edition, which does a record keeping, it actually stores records for any player. You just have to put in your initials and birthday. But they programmed our initials and birthdays so that if you put in our initials and birthdays, our heads and names pop up on the player's body. So you can.
That's funny.
My head.
Oh wow, that is amazing. That's like an awesome little Easter egg right there. Like to think, I
got a lot of mileage out of that back in the 80s and or back in the 90s. Rather, if I was in an arcade and there was an NBA Jam tournament edition, I'd play as myself, and people would be like, "Well, how did you do that? Wait a minute."
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's amazing. That's awesome.
So you helped with the T2 Judgment Day?
Yes, I was on the development team for T2 and Revolution X. There was the core team was 3 programmers and 3 artists. I wasn't the lead on either of them. George Petro was the lead, and Jack Hager was the art lead. And the teams grew as we needed other people to finish the projects. But yeah, they both had core teams of about 6 people each.
Wow,
Cool.
I remember.
That game was intense.
Yeah,
that was the one with the guns, right? You had to. I remember, and there was like 2 players. Oh,
that's a good one.
I remember that being huge. I don't think I stopped. I spent a lot of money on that game.
That was a very popular game. Yeah. My contribution, I programmed a bunch of things in that game, but my main contribution, I think, was the SWAT van level. That was all me. You're in the SWAT van, and then the helicopter comes in and tries to smash into you, and you have to shoot to keep it away. And then the truck comes in, and you have to. Yeah, I love doing that. I thought that was great.
When the games come out, you've been on them, you've played, you go and you are searching them out to play them in public. Like, do you want to see that working in public?
I mean, it's nice to see, but I've kind of been there. It's like they don't.
I can answer that question
for me,
Right.
But no, I mean, listen. The other thing I think you need to realize is I don't think anybody ever expected any of these games to still be around now. Right. I mean, they were made to be disposable entertainment. It's got a 6-month life. And then everybody's moving on to the next thing. The fact that anybody still remembers or talks about any of these games is just astounding to me and probably most of the people I work with.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because, like, obviously with our podcast, we're not, there's a lot of nostalgia, and the fact that there's probably times throughout your career that all of a sudden it's like, wait, why are you bringing this up 10 years ago? Like, there's waves probably of like, oh, everyone's bringing up Q*bert again. Like, and there's like groups that play like at my brewery, we have like retro game night. That's LITHOLOGY brewing.com, because it's a thing. Like, we have Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Nintendo, like it's all up there because people are more interested in playing, not for a while. They don't want to play for hours, but they want to remember what it was like to play that game. And it is a little bit more challenging. Like, even my nieces and nephew, we bought them Arcade Up. I don't know if you know that company.
The 1-Up, yeah, sure.
1-Up, that's what I mean. So we bought him a 1-Up like Mrs. Pac-Man like game, and there's like Dig Dug is on there, and I hadn't played Dig Dug in forever. And there's a Bubble Bobble, and I was like,
God.
What? I could play Bubble Bobble for like all day long. And even at the brew, I just got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the 4-player game, which I thought it was like, as I'm playing it, I'm like, this was such a quarter grab. Like you just wanted to constantly keep playing and just buttons. And I don't know if I even knew what I was doing. I was just hitting A and B, and I was like, this is just so much fun. So it's crazy. Like you're seeing all this now. A major question I have is, so now you have the Oculus. Are you still programming till this day?
I do a little bit. Yeah,
you do. Is gameplay now going to be as nostalgic as the games back in the day were?
I would say probably yes, because the way nostalgia works, people become nostalgic for whatever they had in their childhood. That's just the way nostalgia works. I remember in the 1970s, there was a huge nostalgia for the 1950s. Everything was 1950s. Everybody loved the 1950s. And I do believe it happens on 20-year cycles for a very specific reason. You know, when you're 8 or 6, you know, that's your childhood. And then when you're 26, suddenly you're an adult with a job who has money to consume. And that's where you can actually spend money trying to relive parts of your childhood. So I think there's a very, understandable reason for that. So, yeah, I think whatever people were into when they were a child, as an adult, that's what they're going to be nostalgic for.
Mm-hmm. So people are going to be playing Fortnite 20 years from now.
Sorry, bud.
Anytime I've tried, I got killed immediately, and I'm just like, I can't
get into that game. I don't know. Like, my nephew plays all these games, and I'm like, I don't know. I just want to play games that I liked when I was younger, and I have the Oculus, and I think it's mind blowing, but I still find myself going towards the Nintendos, and I guess it's because it's just familiar, like what you're saying. It's just like the joy of being a child, the joy of that. That play. Yeah.
Well, the beauty of our world is that you can choose your forms of entertainment, some people love games, some people love, watching sports on TV or going to live sports. Everybody's into different things, and that's, none of it is right or wrong. If there's something that you click with, something that you love, and it's there for you, it's fantastic.
So do you play games?
I do not spend a whole lot of time playing games. I've tried. I've got a PS4 and I've got a VR headset because I do love VR. I love virtual reality. I think the potential for it is phenomenal. But I don't know that it's being used exactly the way I would want to see it used. I'd love to see it used for even non-game like things. I think it's a great tool for visiting places you can't be and things like that. Virtual museums, I think it would be a great thing. And I know that some of those exist. I don't know that I have seen any personally, but I actually worked on a system back in like 2008 that had the potential for that, but it fortunately didn't go anywhere. But yeah, I love VR. But I don't love many modern games. I just, I do find that a lot of games rely too much on cutscenes because they want to tell a story.
Yeah.
And in order to tell a story, they have to show you stuff. I don't want to sit there and watch a movie. I don't want to sit there and watch a movie honestly, if a cutscene is more than 15 seconds, it's too long because I'm not playing a game. I'm sitting and watching a movie then. Yeah. And there are cutscenes that are 2 and 3 minutes. I'm like, Jesus, get on with it. I want to play the game.
Well, yeah, because now you have like major actors and people like in those games. So it's just like they're coming in, they're getting paid. It's like, well, if we're going to pay you, we're getting 3 minutes out of you. We're not just doing a 15-second cutscene with like Snoop Dogg. You're going to stand there and you're going to say 3 minutes of dialogue. And I think that's kind of changes the gaming experience. I think you're right because all the games, if I play a modern game and there's a cutscene, I'm looking for like, can I skip through this? Like, is there a way to get through this? Because none of this matters to me unless you're telling me. No,
none of it does. I just want to play the game.
The promise.
I don't care about the story. I just want to solve the puzzle. Come on.
The promise of video games is interactivity. You don't play a video game because you want to sit there and watch a movie. I'm sorry. That just blows my mind that some really big titles
Huge.
just spend too much time in cutscenes.
Yeah.
And then also, your controls. It's like, I understand the attempt to make an interactive story because honestly, that's something I always wanted video games to turn into, interactive stories. But I think the key is interactive. If you're just pushing a button once in a while and the story is taking you along, that's not it. That's not, then I think that's not the right way to go. But there are games I think that do approach what I'm saying. I wouldn't say there aren't any, but I don't have time, honestly, to spend weeks and weeks delving into a, some of these games have, they're like 40 hours of play and stuff. And I don't have the patience, unfortunately. I like something shorter.
Did you ever play the game Myst?
Holy nostalgia.
Oh yeah.
Did you like it?
I did. I loved
that game.
And because
you were saying you like puzzles, I thought that was like just an island of puzzles.
Exactly. That's So it makes you use your brain. It makes you think, and yet it's still entertaining. It's beautiful to look at. And it also it actually was proof of another theory of mine, is that graphics are nice, but they are not what make the game work. Like a lot of people are like, oh, we got to get the water to ripple just right. Oh my God, this hair, this fur, these fur algorithms, it's so realistic. Listen, people played Pong and they were entertained with a square ball moving on a black background. It's not the graphics that make the game work. And sometimes there are people who get too caught up in the graphics, but the thing in Myst was the graphics were beautiful, but they were basically still pictures. Yeah. You didn't need the movement. You didn't need like video, and you filled in the rest. It's also kind of like, I love radio drama. I've always been fascinated with the idea that you create these pictures in your mind just by hearing audio. And that's come back a lot with a lot of podcasts, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I loved Myst. And I also loved a game called Shivers. I don't know if you ever met. It was a PC game, but it was like a really creepy, scary environment, but it was basically puzzle solving too. And I think my favorite game of all time has to be the Pandora Directive. I don't know if you remember that. That
sounds familiar.
It was a Tex Murphy game. There was a character, Tex Murphy, who was in a bunch of games, but this one just had an amazing blend of story and interactivity and action. There was some, you were like, a lot of it was discovering clues and talking to people, but then there were also these like action scenes. I just thought it was really, really well done. Kudos.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
What was it again?
The Pandora
Directive.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Wow.
Google it.
The recent one that I played was I think it was called The Room. That's like another puzzle thing where like, you have to like move the puzzle around and figure out like what it's like. There's no hints. Like it's just like figure this puzzle out. And you're like, what? Yeah. I'm really big into that. And like, I apologize that I didn't really play Q*bert as a kid, but now that you talked about it's like a puzzle, I'm like, I'm going to
you gotta play
figure out how to play this game.
I played that all the time.
Dan, you were so like, I saw your face, Dan, when you were talking about it. I was like, oh my God, how did I not play this game as a child? Like, I'm like trying to figure out what game I played.
I played it
at Nathan's. I'm like, at Nathan's, I remember like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker game was on there. Like, I was just like game. Thinking about all the different, that was a weird game. But like Q*bert, I never really like. I maybe played that one time, but I'm like, wait, it's a puzzle game? Like, I'm down.
I think it was because
definitely going to be checking that out.
I think it was because I had an Atari, and then I played it in the arcade. But I had an Atari, and Atari tried to emulate that arcade like gameplay with the controller. So you had Q*bert, I had Robotron, Centipede, like these things that were just in like a kind of a box, and like you have the gameplay there. But yeah, man. I mean, Warren, I feel like we could go on for another 3 hours.
I was going to ask you about, did you ever hear about the game The Incredible Machine? The Incredible Machine.
Wow, that sounds very familiar. I think I have encountered that in my travels.
It's basically like they give you a couple of things. They're like, all right, there's a switch, and you need to turn off the switch. Here's a basketball, a fan, and trampoline. And you have to like move the things in certain ways to get the basketball to shut off the switch, and like every puzzle got harder, and like this room, the gravity was, this, so everything floats a little bit. So it was, they haven't redone it. And I'm like waiting for, like, I want Oculus to like come up with the incredible machine. Yeah. Oculus has the room, and the Mist, I believe, is coming out with for Oculus. And I was like, oh, I'm getting that.
See,
I want to be in Mist.
If Oculus comes up with a Maniac Mansion, then I'm going to get it, because Maniac Mansion, I used to play that constantly on Nintendo, and I couldn't get enough of that game. And I wish they, would come out, with another version of that, but there would probably be 1,000 cutscenes, and Maniac Mansion had a few, but for a Nintendo game. But yeah, it's just, I just feel like when we think of video games, like we sometimes always forget, like we always are in the present of the games, but we forget of the rich, amazing history that gaming and video games and arcades, especially arcade games, being like the foundation really of the things that we're seeing, and how much, has went into them, and everyone that's out there, have created these. But Warren, thank you so much for coming and talking about your experiences. I mean, I feel like this just scratches the surface. I feel like we have to have you back and really get into some of this other stuff. But
well, absolutely, I'd be happy to come back. But I have to say that you're talking about video game history. It's interesting. It's a subject that I've become aware in the last, 10 years or so, that is really ballooned. A lot of people are suddenly, for me, it seems suddenly interested in video game history, and to that end, I actually wrote a memoir. So if anybody is interested in hearing more, actually, I think I told some stories in this podcast that are not in the book, if I remember. So kudos to you guys for pulling those out of me. But I wrote this book, originally self-published, and then basically it came out and there was a pandemic. So I wasn't able to really promote it. But I contacted publishers during the pandemic, the early days, 2020, found a publisher who was interested in publishing it. And just this month, a couple of weeks ago, officially came out in hardback.
Wow.
Hardback.
I know that, this is probably, most people will not be seeing this on. They're just hearing, but
we'll take a picture and we'll post this video on our Instagram.
I'll make a sound here. Hang on.
It's a real book, everybody. It looks beautiful.
It's
And we'll put the link to the book like in the show notes and everything like that.
Sure. Yeah, and it's available, wherever books can be ordered online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or your favorite independent bookstore. If you want to support them. And also people have asked if they could get autographed copies, and that's why I have it available on my site, warrendavisshop.square.site, and people can order it autographed if they want.
Wow. That's awesome.
But there's a lot of stories in there, not only about my Gottlieb days, but also about my, Williams days, and more. And before, after, there's my entire history. I don't talk too much about my personal life because that's boring. Who wants to read about that, right? So I tried to keep it on point, and it's gotten some great reviews, which I'm very grateful for. So I hope people enjoy it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I can't wait to read more about it. I can't, and I wish we could have like 4 hours, because I would want so much more. But that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming by.
My pleasure.
And everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, definitely check out Warren's book. Go there. We'll put the link in the show notes. Hit that link and go and get that book. It's really, the reviews are really amazing. And, everyone, also support a local artist and someone who's, in books and reading, all good things. But
Dan loves books.
Love it. But also, hit us with a nice review on Spotify. Tell us what you think about this episode, and also any questions about it. Or what are your favorite games? Like remembering your favorite arcade games. We'd love to see them and hear about them, and post that right in the comments. But Warren, thank you again so much for being here.
Been a pleasure. You guys are awesome.
And is there how can people, is there any way people could follow you or anything else? Are you on social media?
Yeah. I mean, I don't waste a lot of time on social media, but I do have a little presence there. People can connect with me on Twitter at Warren Davis 29. And on Facebook, I have a private page, which a lot of people friend me, but I will not really accept your friend request on my private page. But I have a public page too. It's facebook.com/WarrenDavis29.
Awesome.
Please, come over and like that page. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely. And we'll put the link to that as well so that everyone can go and like the page and friend Warren. But Warren, again, thank you so much. This has been so fun. Super. I love listening and learning about these things. This is super great. So thank you so much for coming.
Loved being here, guys. Thank you again.
Awesome. All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the Nostalgia Test podcast to know when new episodes drop. Don't forget to leave us 5 stars and a positive review so more people can find the podcast. Share your thoughts and memories on today's topic on our Twitter @NostalgiaTest and on Instagram @TheNostalgiaTest. Tune in next time because you never know what pop culture will pop up on The Nostalgia Test.